As Barron Trump steps forward to help a collapsed man on the freezing streets of Manhattan, he discovers a heartbreaking note, a desperate father's plea to save his missing daughter. Determined to uncover the truth, Barron's act of kindness pulls him into a dangerous mystery that will change his life forever. What happens next is unbelievable. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The biting chill of December swept through the towering skyscrapers of Manhattan, turning the city into an icy maze of hurried footsteps and indifferent faces. Snowflakes spiraled through the air, disappearing as they landed on the gray pavement, blending into the lifelessness of winter. People bustled past one another, wrapped in thick coats, too consumed by their own worries to notice much of anything. But amid the rhythmic chaos, something unexpected shattered the ordinary. A man collapsed onto the pavement, his body convulsing as he clutched his chest. At first, no one reacted. A few pedestrians slowed their pace, eyes flickering toward the man's trembling figure before quickly looking away, unwilling to involve themselves. A woman in a business suit hesitated, her hand hovering near her phone, but instead of calling for help, she pressed record. The world had grown accustomed to watching tragedy rather than preventing it. Whispers fluttered through the crowd. Some pointed, others continued walking, and the city resumed its merciless march forward. A sleek black limousine rolled to a stop just a few feet away, its tinted windows concealing its high-pressure occupant. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, waiting for instruction. The back door opened slowly, and from the car emerged Barron Trump. His tall frame and composed posture made him stand out even more against the bleak city backdrop. His name alone commanded attention, and in any other setting, people might have swarmed him. But at this moment, no one expected him to care. Yet, he did. His sharp blue eyes quickly assessed the situation, narrowing as he saw the way no one helped. A flicker of irritation passed through him. He had grown up surrounded by power, privilege, and security, yet none of it meant anything if a man could die on the street while the world simply watched. Without hesitation, Barron stepped forward, his polished shoes pressing against the icy pavement. As he knelt beside the man, his expensive coat barely shielding him from the freezing ground, the murmurs around him intensified. Why was he helping? The billionaire's son? The one who had never had to worry about survival? "Call 911, he barked at his driver, his voice steady yet urgent. The driver, initially taken aback, snapped into action, pulling out his phone. The collapsed man's eyes fluttered open, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His skin was deathly pale, his lips cracked. "Help me," he whispered, his voice so faint that Barron had to lean in closer to hear it. "You're going to be all right," Barron assured him, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. The man's fingers trembled, barely able to grip onto the fabric of Barron's coat. Something about him, his frail form, the sheer desperation in his weak grasp, sent an unexpected ache through Barron's chest. He had never met this man before, had no reason to care, and yet he couldn't look away. The blaring sirens of an approaching ambulance cut through the heavy silence. The paramedics rushed out, pushing through the bystanders who had done nothing but watch. They quickly assessed the man, strapping him onto a stretcher. As they lifted him, a small, crumpled piece of paper slipped from his pocket, landing at Barron's feet. No one else seemed to notice, but Barron did. He bent down, picking it up carefully. The edges were frayed, the ink smudged, but the words, written in trembling handwriting, were clear enough to stop Barron cold. "To anyone who finds this, I'm sorry I failed. Please take care of my daughter. Her name is Lily." Barron's fingers tightened around the note. A slow, uneasy breath left his lips. A daughter? He looked back at the man now being wheeled toward the ambulance, his body barely clinging to life. Barron's mind swirled with questions. Who was this man? Where was Lily? And why did this feel so painfully personal? He exhaled, tucking the note into his pocket, his decision made in an instant. "Follow the ambulance," he instructed his driver as he climbed back into the limo. The engine roared to life, merging back into the pulsing veins of the city. As the limousine navigated through the streets, Barron gazed out the window, his expression unreadable. For years, the world had judged him based on his last name. They assumed he lived in a bubble of privilege, far removed from real struggles. But this moment wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about politics. It was about doing the right thing. He had no idea that this single act of kindness would change his life forever. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and quiet desperation, the kind that lingered in the hallways and clung to the air like an unspoken grief. Barron Trump strode through the automatic doors, his presence causing an almost immediate shift in the atmosphere. Heads turned, nurses whispered, patients stole glances, but he ignored all of it. He wasn't here to be recognized. He was here because of the note, still clenched in his hand, its paper crumpled from how tightly he had been gripping it. He needed answers. The emergency room was a flurry of movement. Doctors in scrubs rushed from one patient to another. Nurses pushed carts filled with supplies, and machines beeped steadily in the background, all of them signs of life hanging in the balance. But Barron wasn't overwhelmed. He had grown up in rooms filled with chaos. The political kind, the media frenzy, the ruthless corporate world. This was different. This was real. Approaching the reception desk, he cleared his throat. The man who was just brought in, mid-50s, thin, dark coat. "Where is he?" The nurse looked up, surprised to see him standing there. But she didn't flinch. New York nurses were used to celebrities. "Are you family?" Barron hesitated. No, he wasn't family. He didn't even know the man's name, but he knew something deeper than that. He was this man's only chance. "I was with him when he collapsed," Barron said, his voice steady, unwilling to be dismissed. "I need to know if he's okay." The nurse sighed, flipping through the intake files before glancing at him. "He's in room 407, but he's unconscious. Doctor's still assessing him." That was enough. Barron nodded and turned toward the elevator, stepping inside as the doors slid shut. He tapped his foot impatiently, eyes staring at the glowing numbers counting up. 407. That was where he would start. When he arrived at the room, he paused for a moment at the door before stepping inside. The man lay in the hospital bed, a shell of himself. His skin was gray, his breathing shallow, and IV lines ran from his arms to beeping monitors that kept him tethered to life. A fighter. Barron pulled the chair closer and sat down, studying the man's frail features. "Who are you?" he muttered under his breath. A groaned. Barron sat up straighter. The man's fingers twitched slightly, and then his eyes flickered open. For a moment, they stared at each other. Barron leaned in. "You're in a hospital. You collapsed, but you're safe now." The man's lips parted, his voice a broken whisper. "Lily!" The name hit Barron like a hammer. "She's okay," he said instinctively, though he had no way of knowing if that was true. "But I need to find her." The man's chest heaved, a single tear slipping from his eye. "She's alone," he whispered. "I failed her." Barron's hands clenched into fists. The note hadn't been just a plea. It had been a final confession. "You didn't fail her," Barron said, his voice firm. "But I need to know where she is." The man's lips trembled. He struggled to lift his hand, reaching toward Barron with desperation in his eyes. "Promise me," he rasped. "Promise me you'll find her." Barron didn't hesitate. "I promise." The man's head dropped back onto the pillow, his energy spent, and a heart monitor beeped louder as a nurse rushed in to check on him. Barron stepped out of the room, his mission clear. He pulled out his phone and called his driver. "I need you to find out everything about this man, name, address, any records." "Already on it, sir." As he waited for information, Barron stared down at the note in his hand. Lily. Somewhere out there, a little girl was waiting for a father who might never come back. He wasn't going to let her wait alone. Minutes later, his phone buzzed. "We found his address," the driver said. "It's in a rundown part of the city, 4th floor, apartment 16. Barron exhaled. Let's go. The ride across town was a blur. The city lights blurred past the windows as Barron's mind raced. What would he find? A scared little girl? A child who had already lost hope? The limo pulled up to a worn-out apartment building. The brick exterior was chipped, the entrance barely lit by a flickering street lamp. Barron stepped out and took the stairs 2 at a time. His pulse pounded in his ears as he reached apartment 16. He knocked. Silence. Another knock. A small voice from inside. Who is it? Barron's breath caught. I'm here to help. The door creaked open just enough for a pair of big brown eyes to peek out. A little girl, no older than 6. Her face was smudged with dirt, her dark curls unkempt. She clutched a stuffed bunny, its ears nearly torn off from being hugged too tightly. Barron's heart clenched. Are you Lily? He asked softly. The girl hesitated before nodding. Where's my daddy? She whispered. Barron knelt down to her level, his voice gentle. He's in the hospital, he said, but he's going to be okay. And until he's better, I'm going to make sure you're safe. Is that okay? Lily bit her lip, uncertainty flickering across her face. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, Are you a nice person? Barron swallowed past the lump in his throat. I hope so. Slowly, the door creaked open wider, and for the first time, Lily Clark stepped out of the shadows. Barron knew in that moment that this wasn't just a promise he had made to her father. This was a responsibility that he would carry for the rest of his life. The air inside the apartment was thick with silence, broken only by the faint hum of the city outside. Barron stepped over the threshold cautiously, his sharp eyes scanning the dimly lit space. It was smaller than he had imagined, too small for a child to grow up in. The walls were bare except for a single photograph taped near the kitchenette, a faded image of Lily as a baby in her father's arms. Lily followed him hesitantly, clutching her stuffed bunny tightly. She didn't trust him yet. Barron knew better than to force the moment, so he kept his voice soft, controlled. Do you live here alone? He asked, kneeling to her level. Lily nodded, then shook her head. Daddy comes home sometimes, but sometimes he doesn't. Barron clenched his jaw. How long had she been left alone like this? How often had she gone to sleep, not knowing if her father would ever come back? His phone buzzed in his pocket, but he ignored it. Lily was more important. Do you have any other family? He asked. Someone who checks on you? Lily hesitated, her small hands tightening around the worn fabric of her bunny. There was a lady who came sometimes, she admitted. She had papers. She said I needed a new home. Barron's stomach dropped. A social worker. If someone had already been monitoring Lily's situation, that meant she was at risk of being taken into foster care. Lily's voice grew even quieter. But Daddy always said no. Barron could tell she didn't fully understand what that meant, but he did. Ethan Clark had been fighting to keep his daughter. Even in his worst moments, he had refused to let her go. Barron sighed, running a hand through his hair. Lily, he said carefully, if something happens and your dad can't take care of you right now, would you want to stay with someone else? Lily frowned, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Would Daddy come back for me? Barron exhaled slowly, his heart twisting. He couldn't promise that. I don't know, he admitted, but I can promise you won't be alone. Lily looked down, toes scuffing the floor. Finally, she whispered, I don't like being alone. Barron nodded. Then you won't be. He stood up, making a quick decision. She couldn't stay here. The apartment was cold, barely livable. There was no food in the kitchen, no blankets on the bed. If social services came back, she would be gone before her father even woke up. Barron pulled out his phone and texted his driver. Bring the car around. We're taking Lily somewhere safe. Lily must have sensed the shift because she stepped back, her grip on her bunny tightening. Are you taking me away? Barron crouched again, looking her in the eyes. No one is taking you away, he said firmly. But I don't want you to stay here by yourself. It's too cold. I have a warm place with food and a big bed. You can stay there until your dad is better. Lily chewed on her lip, considering. "Do you have cartoons?" Barron chuckled, despite the heaviness in his chest. "Lots of cartoons." She hesitated, then finally whispered, "Oh." Barron exhaled in relief. He didn't want to scare her, but he knew something wasn't right. His instinct screamed that they weren't safe here. A knock at the door made them both freeze. Barron's body tensed. Something was wrong. He glanced at Lily, who looked just as alarmed. "Does anyone else come here?" She shook her head. Barron slowly approached the door and peered through the peephole. A man in a leather jacket stood outside, his face obscured by the dim light of the hallway. He wasn't a landlord. He wasn't a neighbor. Barron's pulse quickened. Whoever he wasn't here for good reasons. Another knock. Louder this time. "Lily," Barron whispered, kneeling beside her. "Go to your room and stay there. Don't come out until I say, okay?" Lily's small face was pale, but she nodded and ran into the tiny bedroom, shutting the door behind her. Barron took a deep breath and opened the door just enough to keep the chain lock in place. The man's gaze was sharp as he took in Barron's face. Surprise flickered across his features. He hadn't been expecting him. "You're not Ethan," the man said, his voice low and edged with something dangerous. Barron didn't flinch. "Who are you?" The man smirked. "A friend. I just came to check on him." "Ethan's in the hospital," Barron said evenly. "He won't be back for a while." The man frowned, then leaned in slightly. "Too close." "And the girl?" Barron's fingers curled into a fist. "She's not here." The man's eyes darkened, suspicion creeping in. "That's so?" Barron didn't blink. "That's so." A tense silence stretched between them. The man stared hard at Barron, as if weighing whether he was telling the truth. Finally, he stepped back. "Tell Ethan he owes me," he said. "Time's up." Without another word, he turned and disappeared down the hallway. Barron shut the door and locked it, his heart pounding. What had he just stepped into? He walked to Lily's room and opened the door. She was sitting on the bed, hugging her bunny tightly. "Was that a bad man?" she whispered. Barron hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, but you don't have to worry. I won't let him hurt you." Lily looked at him with those big brown eyes, so full of trust. Barron exhaled, knowing he couldn't wait any longer. He scooped Lily up into his arms and carried her out of the apartment. She didn't resist, resting her small head against his shoulder. As he stepped into the cold night air, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about protecting a little girl anymore. It was about stopping whatever danger was coming for her father. And Barron Trump wasn't going to back down. The black SUV glided through the streets of Manhattan, its tinted windows shielding Barron and Lily from the world outside. The city never slept, but tonight it felt quieter, as if the shadows themselves were watching. Barron's grip on the steering wheel tightened. His mind replayed the confrontation with the man in the leather jacket. The words, "Tell Ethan he owes me. Time's up," echoed in his ears like a warning bell. Lily sat in the back seat, her small hands clutching her stuffed bunny so tightly its fabric was nearly torn. She hadn't spoken much since they left the apartment. She stared out the window, her big brown eyes reflecting the city lights, but her silence wasn't that of a child lost in thought. It was fear. Barron glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Lily," he said gently, trying to ease the tension. "Are you okay?" She nodded, but her lips trembled. Barron sighed. "You don't have to be brave all the time, you know." She looked at him then, eyes filled with a mixture of uncertainty and something deeper. Trust. "Who was that man?" she whispered. Barron hesitated. How much could he tell her? How much did she already know? "He's someone from your dad's past," Barron admitted carefully. "Someone we need to stay away from." Lily clutched her bunny tighter, her tiny voice shaking. "Is Daddy in trouble?" Barron clenched his jaw. "I think so." Silence filled the car again, but this time it was heavier. Barron had made up his mind. He needed answers. He couldn't just protect Lily. He had to understand what Ethan Clark had done to make dangerous men come looking for him. And for that, he needed help. 20 minutes later, the SUV pulled into an underground parking lot beneath a sleek high-rise. The building was one of the lesser-known Trump properties, a place where discretion was a guarantee. As the elevator doors closed behind them, Barron pulled out his phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "You better have a damn good reason for calling me at this hour, kid." Barron exhaled. "I need information, Daniels." Daniels was a former Secret Service agent, now a private investigator with a talent for finding things people wanted buried. There was a pause. "I take it this isn't about your family." "No," Barron said. "It's about Ethan Clark." The line was silent for a moment, then a low whistle came through. "That's a name I haven't heard in years." "You know him?" "Not personally, but I know the kind of people who do." Barron's pulse quickened. "Then you also know why someone's looking for him." Daniels exhaled sharply. "Ethan was part of a covert military operation years ago. Rumor is, something went wrong and a lot of powerful people got burned. He disappeared after that, until now." Barron's stomach twisted. Ethan wasn't just a struggling father. He was a man running from something. "I need to know exactly who's after him," Barron said. "And I need to know now." Daniels hesitated. "This isn't a game, kid. If you're involved, you need to be ready for what happens next." Barron's gaze flickered to Lily, who was watching him with tired eyes. There was no turning back. "I'm ready." Daniels sighed. "Give me a few hours. I'll call you back." Barron ended the call, tension knotted in his chest. He turned to Lily, who was sitting on the couch in the suite, swinging her legs. "Lily, I need you to tell me something. Did your dad ever talk about why he had to move so much?" She shook her head. "No, he just said we had to stay quiet, that bad people were looking for him." Barron ran a hand through his hair. This was bigger than he thought. Lily's voice softened. "Is Daddy coming back?" Barron hesitated, then crouched in front of her. "I'm going to do everything I can to make sure he does." Her lip trembled. "Promise?" Something about the way she said it shattered him. "I promise." She reached out and placed her stuffed bunny in his lap. "You should have this. It helps when you're scared." Barron swallowed the lump in his throat. "Thank you, Lily. But I'm not scared." Lily gave him a look that was far too wise for a child her age. "Yes, you are." Barron smiled. Maybe she was right. A few hours later, Barron's phone buzzed. It was Daniels. "Found something," the investigator said grimly. Ethan wasn't just part of a mission gone wrong. He found evidence of illegal arms deals. He tried to expose it. People got killed because of what he knew. And the people responsible? They want to make sure he never talks. Barron's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about Ethan. If they know where he is, they know about Lily, Barron realized. Daniels hesitated. "Yeah, Kit, they do." Barron's grip tightened on the phone. "Then we have to move fast." "I pulled some strings," Daniels said. "I can get you and the girl out of the city, somewhere safe." Barron shook his head. Running wasn't an option anymore. "I need to talk to Ethan." Daniels exhaled. "That's going to be tough. He's still in bad shape." "I don't care," Barron said. "We don't have time." Daniels was silent for a moment before muttering, "You're just like your father, stubborn as hell." Barron didn't argue. This wasn't about his father. This was about doing what was right. He ended the call and turned to Lily, who was curled up on the couch, half asleep. "We're going to see your dad," he said softly. Her eyes fluttered open, full of hope. "Really?" Barron nodded. "Really." But deep down, he knew that if they didn't move fast, there might not be a reunion at all. As he tucked the stuffed bunny into his coat pocket and prepared to leave, he knew one thing. This fight wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about keeping Lily safe, no matter the cost. The hospital loomed ahead, its towering facade cold against the backdrop of the Manhattan skyline. Barron gripped the steering wheel as the SUV came to a stop near the emergency entrance. His pulse hammered in his ears. This wasn't just a visit. This was a race against time. Lily stirred beside him, rubbing her tired eyes. "Are we really going to see Daddy?" she asked, her voice small, full of fragile hope. Barron nodded, forcing a reassuring smile. "Yes, but we have to be quick." He had barely put the car in park before he felt the weight of something off. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The hospital, usually bustling at this hour, was eerily quiet. Daniels had warned him the people hunting Ethan wouldn't just sit back and wait. They knew he was alive, and if they knew that, then they knew where to find him. Barron reached for Lily's hand. "Stay close to me, okay?" She nodded, squeezing his fingers tightly as they slipped into the hospital. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Barron led Lily through the halls. His mind raced through the information Daniels had given him. Ethan had tried to expose corruption at the highest levels, and had nearly cost him his life. Now, the people who wanted him silenced weren't just after him. When they reached Ethan's room, Barron stopped cold. The door was ajar. Something was wrong. A nurse stepped out, nearly colliding with him. Her face was pale, her hands trembling as she fumbled with her clipboard. "You're here for Mr. Clark?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Barron nodded, already knowing the answer before she said it. "He's gone." Lily gasped beside him. "Gone? Where did they take him?" The nurse shook her head. I don't know. 2 men came in. They had paperwork, said they were moving him to a more secure facility, but something felt off." Barron's stomach sank. They had gotten to him first. He turned to Lily, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Stay here with the nurse, okay?" "No," she clung to his jacket. "I want to go with you." Barron swallowed hard. She had already lost too much. "I promise I'll bring him back." His voice was steady, even though inside he felt like the ground was crumbling beneath him. Lily sniffled but nodded. "Be careful." Barron turned on his heel and strode down the hallway, his fists clenched. He needed to move fast. Ethan didn't have much time. Daniels picked up on the first ring. "They took him," Barron said, his voice low, urgent. "Damn it," Daniels cursed. "I was afraid of this. Do you have a lead?" A pause. Then, "Yeah. Traffic cameras caught an unmarked black van leaving the hospital 10 minutes ago, headed toward the docks." Barron's blood ran cold. If they were taking him to the docks, it meant one thing. They weren't planning on keeping him alive. "I'm on my way," Barron said, already moving toward his car. Daniels sighed. "Kid, listen. This isn't your fight. You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," Barron shot back. "Because no one else will." Daniels was silent for a moment. Then, "All right, I'll meet you there." Barron ended the call and floored the gas pedal, weaving through traffic. His heart pounded against his ribs. If he didn't make it in time, Ethan Clark was as good as dead. The black van was parked at the far end of the docks, its rear doors open. Inside, Ethan lay barely conscious, his wrists zip-tied, his face bloodied. 3 men stood around him, their hushed voices lost beneath the crashing waves. Barron pulled up a few yards away, killing the headlights. There was no time to think, only to act. He stepped out of the car, his jaw tight, his pulse steady. "Let him go." The men turned, their eyes narrowing. One of them, the same leather-jacketed man from before, smirked. "You again?" Barron's hands curled into fists. "I'm not going to ask twice." The man chuckled darkly. "You think you can walk in here and make demands? You have no idea what you're messing with, kid." Barron took a step closer. "Maybe not, but I do know one thing. If you kill him, the truth dies with him." The smirk faltered. "I have the files," Barron pressed. "Everything Ethan risked his life for. You think taking him out erases it? It doesn't." The leader's jaw clenched. He exchanged a look with his men. The hesitation was brief, but it was there. And then, chaos. A flash of headlights, the screech of tires. Daniels's car came barreling onto the scene. The men scrambled. One of them reached for a gun, but Barron was faster. He lunged forward, slamming his fist into the man's wrist, knocking the gun loose. The weapon clattered to the ground. Barron didn't stop. He drove his elbow into the man's gut, sending him stumbling backward. Daniels jumped out of the car, his own gun drawn. "Drop it!" he barked. The leader cursed, then turned and bolted. The others followed. Barron wasted no time. He rushed to Ethan's side, cutting through the zip ties with a pocket knife. "Ethan, can you hear me?" Ethan groaned, his eyes fluttering open. His gaze landed on Barron. Recognition flickered. "Lily," he rasped. "She's safe," Barron reassured him. "You're going to see her again." Ethan's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths. "You saved me." Barron shook his head. "No, you saved yourself. I just made sure you got the chance." Sirens wailed in the distance. Daniels exhaled, lowering his gun. "Well, kid, looks like you actually pulled it off." Barron let out a shaky breath. It was over. Or at least, this part was. 2 hours later, Ethan was back in the hospital, for real this time. The danger had passed, but the damage remained. Lily practically flew into her father's arms the moment she saw him, sobbing into his chest. Barron stood back, watching the scene unfold, his heart heavy but full. Ethan met his gaze over Lily's head. "I owe you everything." Barron shook his head. "You owe me nothing, just be there for her." Ethan swallowed hard. "I will." As Barron turned to leave, Lily ran up and threw her arms around him. "Thank you," she whispered. Barron knelt, hugging her tightly. "Anytime, kid." As he walked out of the hospital, he knew that this was just the beginning, because sometimes doing the right thing wasn't just a choice. It was a responsibility. And Barron Trump wasn't going to stop now. The hospital room was dimly lit, a sharp contrast to the storm raging outside. Rain lashed against the window, and distant thunder rumbled through the city. Barron stood by the door, his hands in his pockets, watching as Ethan Clark struggled to sit up in bed. The bruises on his face were already darkening, and the IV in his arm delivered much-needed fluids to his battered body. But it wasn't just the physical pain that weighed on Ethan. It was the crushing weight of everything that had happened. Lily was curled up in the chair beside him, her tiny hand clutching his fingers even in sleep. She had refused to leave his side, afraid that if she let go, he would disappear again. Ethan looked up at Barron, his eyes filled with something between gratitude and guilt. "I don't even know where to start," he muttered, his voice hoarse. Barron exhaled sharply, stepping closer. "Start with the truth." Ethan hesitated, his gaze flickering to his daughter, then back to Barron. "The truth," he repeated, almost as if the word itself was foreign to him. He sighed, rubbing his face with his free hand. "All right, you deserve that much." Barron crossed his arms. "I know about your past, Ethan, the classified files, the operation overseas, the betrayal." He met Ethan's gaze, unwavering. "I also know that the people who came after you tonight weren't just debt collectors. They were cleaning up loose ends." Ethan's body tensed at the words. For a long moment, the only sound was the beeping of the heart monitor. Then finally Ethan spoke. "I was part of an off-the-books unit," he admitted. "We were sent into places the government didn't want to acknowledge. Missions no one wanted to take credit for." His fingers curled into a fist. "One day we found something we weren't supposed to. Evidence of corruption, war profiteering at the highest levels. When I tried to report it, they turned on me." Barron's jaw tightened. "They framed you." Ethan nodded. "Took my name, my rank, everything. When I got back, I was a nobody. No job, no money. I couldn't even get medical care. I did what I had to in order to survive, but it was never enough." His voice broke. "I tried to give Lily a good life, but—" "You did," Barron interrupted firmly. "You kept her safe. That's more than most would have done." Ethan looked down at his daughter, his expression torn. "I failed her," he whispered. Barron shook his head. "No. The people who betrayed you failed her." Ethan met his gaze, his eyes filled with something close to desperation. "I don't know how to fix this." Barron clenched his fists. "I do." The next morning, Barron sat in Daniel's office, staring at the flash drive in his hand. The storm had passed, but the tension in the air was thicker than ever. Daniels paced the room, clearly unsettled. "You know what happens if we go public with this, right?" he said. "The people behind this, they don't just sit back and take the hit. They fight back. Hard." Barron met his gaze, unwavering. "I'm not backing down." Daniels exhaled, rubbing his temples. "You're a Trump, kid. That means this isn't just about exposing corruption. The second your name is attached to this, it's a political war." Barron shrugged. "So be it." Daniels shook his head. "You're out of your mind." Barron smirked. "Maybe." Daniels sighed heavily. "All right, we'll do it my way, through the right channels. We send this to trusted journalists, get lawyers involved. We make sure that when this hits, it hits so hard that no one can bury it." Barron nodded. "How long?" "A few days," Daniels replied. "But that's a few days too long if they realize what we're doing." Barron's stomach turned. If they figured out what he had planned, they'd come after Ethan again, and this time, they wouldn't leave any witnesses. Barron returned to the hospital that afternoon, but the moment he stepped onto the floor, he knew something was wrong. The security guard was gone. The nurses looked nervous. And Ethan's room? Empty. Panic surged through Barron's veins as he rushed inside. The bed was unmade, the IV stand tipped over. There had been a struggle. His phone buzzed, an unknown number. He answered without hesitation. "Where is he?" A voice, low and cold, answered. "We warned you to walk away." Barron's grip on the phone tightened. "If you hurt him—" "We don't want him," the voice cut in. "We want the files." A beat of silence. "You have 1 hour." The line went dead. Barron stood there, his mind racing. He had a choice to make. Give them the evidence or risk Ethan's life. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to think. They wouldn't let Ethan go, even if he handed over the files, which meant he needed another plan, fast. Barron called Daniels. "They have Ethan." Daniels swore under his breath. "Of course they do. Where's the meet?" "Warehouse District, Pier 19. Daniels was silent for a moment. "You're walking into a trap." Barron's jaw clenched. "I know." Daniels exhaled. "I'll have a team in place. We're taking these bastards down." Barron looked out the window, his fists tightening. "Make sure we don't leave any loose ends." An hour later, Barron stood at Pier 19, the cold air cutting through his jacket. The black SUV pulled up. 2 men stepped out, dragging Ethan with them. His face was bruised, but he was alive. "Where are the files?" one of the men demanded. Barron held up a flash drive. "Right here." The man smirked. "Smart kid." Barron took a step forward, then everything happened at once. The sound of tires screeching, flashing lights, FBI agents storming the dock. The men panicked, reaching for their guns, but they were too slow. Daniels and his team had them on the ground in seconds. Ethan collapsed as the grip on him loosened. Barron caught him just in time. "Hang in there," Barron said, his voice low. Ethan gave him a weak smile. "Told you, you didn't have to do this." Barron smirked. "Yeah, well, you're kind of bad at taking advice." As sirens blared and agents secured the scene, Barron let out a slow breath. It was over. Or at least, it was just beginning. The flashing lights of police cruisers and FBI vehicles painted the darkened pier in red and blue streaks. The once eerie silence of the waterfront was now filled with the shouts of officers, the crackling of radios, and the heavy footsteps of agents securing the crime scene. Barron stood there, his breath coming in sharp bursts, his pulse still racing from the chaos that had just unfolded. Ethan, battered but alive, sat on the edge of the SUV's open door, a medic tending to the bruises on his face. His hands trembled slightly, not just from exhaustion, but from the realization that, for the first time in years, he wasn't running anymore. The weight of survival had been lifted from his shoulders, and he could finally exhale. Barron crouched next to him, studying his face. "You good?" Ethan exhaled a laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, I mean, better than I was 10 minutes ago." He looked down, his voice softening. I don't even know what to say. Barron shrugged. You don't have to say anything, just get better for Lily. Ethan swallowed hard, nodding. That kid's all I have, Barron. If something had happened to me... He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Barron's jaw tightened. That's why I wasn't going to let them win. Across the lot, Daniels approached, his hands in his pockets. They're in custody, he announced, his voice gruff but satisfied. Your files were enough to crack this thing wide open. The people who tried to erase Ethan? They're going to spend a long time answering for what they did. Ethan let out a long breath, a mixture of relief and disbelief. You mean it's really over? Daniels hesitated before nodding. For the most part, yeah. There will be trials, investigations, but you and Lily, you're safe now. Barron didn't miss the shift in Daniels' tone. He knew better than to believe in a clean ending. There would always be shadows in the corners, always loose ends, but for tonight, this was enough. Barron turned back to Ethan. You're going to need time to get back on your feet, he said. And Lily needs stability, a home. Ethan nodded, rubbing his bruised temple. I know, but after everything, I don't know where to start. Barron didn't hesitate. Start with letting me help. Ethan looked up at him, startled. Barron, you've already done more than enough. Barron smirked. I don't do things halfway. A long silence stretched between them before Ethan finally sighed, shaking his head. You really are your father's son. Barron's smirk faded slightly, his expression turning thoughtful. Yeah, but I like to think I'm doing things my own way. Ethan chuckled, wincing slightly from the pain. That you are, kid. 2 days later, Barron stood outside a small townhouse in a quiet neighborhood. The air was crisp, and the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the city. Inside, Lily sat at the kitchen table, her tiny hands gripping a cup of hot cocoa as she watched the steam rise. Ethan leaned against the doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. I never thought I'd see the day where she could just be a kid again, he murmured. Barron nodded. She deserves that. Ethan glanced at him. And you're sure about this? Barron turned to face him. It's already done. The house is yours. The job? Daniels pulled some strings, got you a security consultant position, good pay, flexible hours. You can be there for Lily. Ethan shook his head, his voice thick. I don't know how to repay you for this. Barron smiled slightly. Just don't waste the second chance you got. Inside, Lily noticed them watching and grinned, waving excitedly. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. Guess I'd better get used to normal life again. Barron clapped him on the shoulder. It's a good look on you. As he turned to leave, Lily suddenly jumped down from her chair and ran after him. Wait! Barron stopped, turning as she threw her tiny arms around his waist, hugging him tightly. Thank you, she whispered against his jacket. Barron swallowed past the lump in his throat, gently resting a hand on her back. Anytime, kid. They walked down the quiet street. He exhaled slowly, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. He hadn't just saved a life. He had changed one. And somehow in the process, he had changed his own. This story is a powerful reminder that one act of kindness can change lives. Barron Trump didn't just help a stranger, he gave hope, protection, and a future to a father and daughter in desperate need. In today's world, where many turn away from those struggling, this story teaches us that compassion and courage can break cycles of suffering. If this inspiring journey moved you, help spread the message, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with others. Let's inspire more acts of kindness, because sometimes the smallest actions leave the biggest impact.